So I just went back and listened to a conversation that Sam Harris had with Andrew Marantz, who is a journalist who writes for the New Yorker and the Guardian, and probably some others too. But he's a woke journalist, as it were. A lot of these big outlets are more and more kind of tied to this very specific ideology, and its emphasis on, race and gender and all of these different things. And I think part of that is because journalism isn't really doing what it used to do before. It doesn't really speak truth to power, and academia doesn't really speak truth to power, and really even politicians aren't necessarily able to make sober, judicious decisions on the behalf of their constituents. I think people along all of these different avenues are actually now essentially involved in a game that requires them to put blinders on and adopt a very specific view of the world, primarily, whether they know it or not because that's the right way of engaging with the world and what is the truest thing or the most righteous thing, but simply for the perpetuation of the systems in which these individuals inhabit. It's actually a sign of institutional rot from what I see of it. When you have the fourth estate, is it the fourth estate? Yeah, of journalism becoming something that is ideological and needs to, cover its ears and close its eyes and, falsify data or dismiss certain data or just demonize people, essentially adopt these kind of superstitious beliefs and so on. It's because the apparatus isn't functioning properly. It's no longer able to kind of self-police and so on. In order for the legacy media to stay relevant, given the fact that they are no longer, that anybody can have access to the internet and information. So it means if you're a publisher, if I create a website right now, or even what I'm doing right now on YouTube, effectively, some person who's just happens to be sitting in next to their bathroom right now is able to appear on the very same screen as someone who's in a gigantic studio somewhere. And the barrier to entry is much lower, and it means that there can be a lot more independent thinkers, there can be a lot more different sorts of analysis and so on. So if you're this gigantic institution that is trying to maintain its relevance, let's say you're CNN or whatever the case may be, the politicians, they don't really need you in the same way that they did, but you need them. And a lot of these institutions still have a name and whatnot. But in order to maintain access or maintain the special relationships, to make sure that CNN, it continues to be the place that certain politicians and stuff want to go in order to speak to an audience or to, break certain stories and stuff like that. It's meant that relationship has become less adversarial and has become more simpatico. The beliefs of the politicians and journalists and academics in this sort of cycle are all aligned in a way to where they can, to where those institutions can perpetuate themselves and kind of pull the wool over their own eyes to be fighting in their own interests, in their own class interests, generally speaking, while feeling in their mind that they're being good and righteous and fighting on the behalf of the little guy, which they're not. So yeah, it means that journalism increasingly becomes, becomes like the PR wing of the political establishment, whether they know it or not. And I think it's gone so far now that anybody that doesn't adhere to this ideology that's emerged, this sort of religion that's emerged, which was necessary in order for intelligent people to be able to go into these institutions and be able to write stories or communicate with people in a way that allows the status quo to be maintained rather than those institutions actually challenging a power and so on. But in order to do that, you have to start distorting reality. You have to start believing in things or seeing the world, or forcing the world into a box that it doesn't necessarily fit in. Because if you didn't have that ideological distortion, I don't think a lot of these people would be able to stand what it is that they're ultimately engaged in, the kind of division that they're engaged in. So this particular conversation that Sam Harris has with Andrew Marantz, I think, is a very good example of the kind of magical thinking and mind reading and so on that a person needs to engage in order to maintain certain views, or to believe certain views, and to justify one's place in the world. So, and at some point, Sam does something like this as well at a certain point of this interview, but this is a really good case study, so I'm gonna go through it starting now.
Let's go to one of the kind of the harder cases, which are more, by definition, more mainstream. And here, I think our intuitions might divide a little bit. And again, I mean, my intuitions here are now sort of newly anchored to the experience of being on the other side of this. I mean, being targeted by people's poorly calibrated racist detectors. So, like, take the cases of Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham, right? So these are both people who I've been interviewed by. I've never met either of them in person, I don't think, but I've been interviewed by each of them a few times, not recently, but you single them out essentially as racist dog whistlers for things they've said recently. And I think, so Laura Ingraham said, Democrats mostly want to replace those old white Yahoo conservatives with a new group who might be a bit more amenable to big government. And that you read as a dog whistle. I believe I can read that more charitably just as a fairly factual statement. I mean, there's so many people on the far left who are banging on and on about white privilege and using whiteness and age and gender, so old white men being the filter against which they would make almost any political decision. I mean, they're advertising this about themselves, and it seems it to be charitable to Laura, and that's an impulse I don't often feel. She could have just been remarking on that and not dog whistling to actual racists.
Okay, so that was a pretty, I just kind of let that play there because, Sam does a great job of that. So this is the way I would frame all of this. My thesis is that the reason that we're in a situation right now where there are people who are journalists and are, supposed to be challenging power and, standing on the behalf of the oppressed and the marginalized and stuff like that. And that's certainly what they talk about all the time. But I think that a lot of the thing of calling people racists and stuff like that, or taking such an uncharitable view, is the result of they need to believe that so that they don't need to face the fact that they are essentially living a lie to a certain degree. When you have people who have been who have gone through terrible economic situations, which is what has happened in a lot of the areas that voted for Donald Trump, and whose life expectancy is decreasing and addiction is on the rise and stuff like that. Clearly, this is a marginalized and group of people. It's a people that are like having trouble, measurably, and whose policies that people on the left, such as this guy, or people on the woke left, I would say that there's a difference between the two. Liberals and people on the woke left, is that he needs to think, people like this need to think that the real reason for all of this, and the reason that Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson or whatever would believe any of this, is just because they're bad people. Because the alternative, that they have legitimate concerns, and that what they're saying is just pretty factual and straightforward, would be just too painful for them. Because, what Laura Ingraham says in that clip is, they say that like the left wants to get rid of, basically old white men that voted for Trump so that they can bring in people who are going to be, from Central and South America, almost certainly, who are more likely to vote for Democrats. But like, how is that? I mean, isn't that just sort of obvious? Like, as Sam just said. So, but they need to view it through this lens of these people just being evil. Because if you're supposed to be standing on the behalf of, the power of the powerless, while you're sitting in your loft in Manhattan and, collecting a 6-figure salary and, having, palling around with celebrities and whatnot, and you have people who are really truly having, problems, and whose policies that you're supporting are doing real harm, you have to, in some way, think that people who are on that side have some sort of moral deficiency, that they're broken in some way, that they're less than. You actually have to dehumanize them, ironically enough. You have to marginalize them in order to perpetuate that worldview. So you get all sorts of like irrational behavior like this. So let's see what he says, rather than you look at this dispassionately. He has to assume motives.
Much less expressing her own racism.
Yeah. So I believe you that you can parse that in a way that you see it as not a dog whistle. I guess I don't see it that way, and I don't really see why I look, I get that it's always possible to read a quote literally as not racist, in the sense that the person is not literally saying in the quote, I, a racist, believe that the white race is superior to the non-white races. Like, in any quote where somebody's not saying those words, it's possible to read it as not racist. I haven't listened to every episode of your show, but I've heard some former episodes where I've heard you do this a few times with Trump, saying, yes, he told, these women of color to go back to their countries, but I'm not sure I see that as a racist dog whistle. And I guess I don't see why we should ignore what's right in front of us and not take the obvious inference from it. There is a very well-known poisonous theory called the Great Replacement Theory that we all know now because they were chanting about it in Charlottesville. And so to the extent that people didn't know about it before that, which I would argue it's probable that Laura Ingraham and Tucker Carlson did know about it before that, but I can't prove it. But we all know about it after that. To then traffic in those words, replacement, and give it an explicitly race-related valence, and then to turn around and deny that you're trafficking in race baiting, it just beggars belief. And I don't, plus you can put it together with a decades-long history of doing similar things and of supporting policies that have those effects. So I guess I don't see why we would try to contort ourselves into, trying to, I get the point of being charitable to people, but this doesn't seem charitable. This seems implausible.
To me, that isn't an obvious inference from what she said. It seems to be, again, it just seems pretty factual. And this is what I don't get. And this is one of the reasons I can't stand folks like this. It's like, we're talking in the country all the time about changing demographics. And I don't know why talking about, when somebody who's conservative is talking about changing demographics, that immediately means that there's some sort of xenophobic, hateful urge behind it. Why would you immediately go to that? And as far as I can tell, I don't know this to be the case, but I hear this kind of thing enough that it makes me think that there's an element of projection going on here. That the reason a guy like this would be so convinced that that these individuals who are saying things that to me seem pretty innocuous and I don't understand what's so hateful about this, or the dog whistle. So if there's a dog whistle, I guess it's going over my head, and I suppose there are some people that are going past my ears, and I suppose there probably are people that could hear that and take the worst possible thing from it and all of these, and could connect it to replacement theory and all of this kind of thing. But I think that I think it's likely that if that's so on the forefront of his mind, another possible explanation could be that really this guy has a problem with the very same things he sees in everybody else. So I look at this guy, and now I'm going to be completely stereotypical. He doesn't look like the strongest, most physically fit, whatever genes allowed this guy to come into existence, whatever characteristics he has in order to have, survived and rose to the position that he's in, they didn't appear to be physical. He looks like a guy. He's kind of gaunt and thin and kind of pale and whatnot. He seems like, it wouldn't surprise me if the guy was sort of sickly in his way. And I think that a lot of people that are sickly, and again, this is all totally speculatory, have issues with germs and with cleanliness, and they can be very kind of neurotic about things like that. And we now know that there is a strong connection between disgust sensitivity. Jordan Peterson has spoken of this, and there's a lot of clinical literature on it. Disgust sensitivity and conservative belief and in racism, essentially. So that people that are in your group, you are more used to and comfortable with them, and you see them as clean and so on, and safe, and you see others, so like brown people or is what his inference would be, you see them as dirty and not safe and whatever. And it sounds to me like, I don't think that this individual is I'm not saying that he's a racist or anything like that. But it wouldn't surprise me. It appears that the urge to be racist is pretty strong in him, because he seems to see it in so many other people. That has to be an element, not maybe even if it isn't with this guy, it has to be with some people who hold these kinds of ideologies and see race anywhere. And I mean, why do I say that? I say it because I've been trying to figure out what it is that's driving this stuff, and just coming up with theories and so on. And you'll notice that the things that upset people the most in any psychological situation are things that a person struggles with themselves. And that is what it is. Just because if someone could struggle with something and then keep it in line, but they see it as, the reason they get so upset when they see it in other people is because they see it as an aspect of themselves. So not to totally virtue signal here, but like, I'm a pretty creative guy. I'm a musician, and I don't know. I do not have high disgust sensitivity. People who are really creative and open, I'm very high in openness on the Big Five scale, tend to like different types of experience and different kinds of people and art. It's kind of just part of being an artist. So that kind of mindset doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. And I'm beginning to think that the reason I don't think other people are racist is because it's not really an urge. I have plenty of my own huge character flaws that are probably much more pronounced than other people's, but this one it's never really made much sense to me. Like being scared of other races and things, or uncomfortable, because I tend to like difference. It excites me. I like variety of various sorts, as to where a guy like this might need to be fighting against his natural urges and has needed to sort of work through that. And in the same way that a lot of we always talk about how the people that are the most homophobic, for example, might have gay urges that they're pushing off, or there's been so many people who have all these other kinds of sexual hang-ups, who it turns out that they have this gigantic pornography addiction, or they're there's all these like really fundamentalist pastors and stuff that are having doing meth and having sex with hookers and all this sort of thing. It's quite often the reason people are so angry about something and are fighting against it so hard and think it's such a big deal is because it is a big deal to them, because it's something they're so focused on. So when somebody is so quick to attribute race, the most like repugnant of motives, to things that don't really merit it, the question shouldn't be, why would you not see what's right in front of you? To me, if you're reading that person's mind and immediately getting something racist from it, and think that is the most likely explanation, what that says to me is that that race and otherness and whatever is something that you struggle with personally. But, and again, I don't want to, if that is the case for Andrew Marantz, I have no reason to think that he hasn't recognized, if this is true, that he hasn't recognized that about himself and has been able to keep all of that stuff in check. And that's part of, why he believes what he believes and speaks about what he speaks about, because maybe, if he wasn't someone who had to consciously fight against his own, racist impulses, or whatever the case may be, his sort of in-group, out-group neuroticism, that he could be, a very different kind of guy. But instead of being somebody who was, but I think his mistake is to assume that that's what everybody else is thinking as well. Because I'm sure some of them are, but I don't think that is the most obvious. But it is strange to me that is the first place that an individual would go to. So anyways.
I mean, I can give you an answer to that question. I mean, why bend over backwards to be charitable, even in the case when you're dealing with someone who you have other reason to believe might be racist? I mean, as in the case with Trump, I just simply don't know enough about Tucker or Laura to have any prejudice about their social attitudes, really. But in the case of Trump, I have a fairly strong sense that he is, not a white nationalist, maybe, not an ideological racist. I don't think he deals with ideas of any kind, but I think he's, at minimum, an Archie Bunker style racist. Like, he's just not comfortable with those people, or not as comfortable, or just, likes white people more. And yet, if you're always
That's probably
going to
Marantz.
read into every utterance the possibility that utterance is a dog whistle or a sign of lurking racism.
If you can hear the whistle, doesn't that make you the dog?
There's several problems with it. One is, if you're going to seize upon the utterance, right, then it's going to have the same valence when someone else speaks those same words. Like that utterance is now radioactive.
Well, maybe, but not always. I mean, well, look, two things. I mean, I'll let you finish, but firstly, I don't want to set up a straw man. I'm not arguing that you should always see everything as a dog whistle. You use the word always. Obviously, I don't think you should always do it. I think you should do it. I don't think you should never do it. That's what I mean by bending over backwards. Yes, of course, I believe in being charitable, but I don't think this is charitable. I think this is taking something that I think has a pretty clear valence, and just because it doesn't have the words "I am a racist" in it, kind of just willfully refusing to see it. That's how I would perceive it.
Well, I mean, the problem with the dog whistle hypothesis.
Okay, so to me, if that language, if the language that was being used there is, to him, just so obviously racially tinged and therefore associated with hatefulness and racism, again, that says a lot more about the way he perceives the world, based on how he thinks everybody else is thinking, than it says about Laura Ingraham or Sam or anyone else.
Hypothesis is that it really is unfalsifiable.
Yes.
It is conspiracy thinking of a sort that gives us all these conspiracy theories whose adherents just cannot be reasoned with.
It's magical thinking.
They find the anomalies everywhere and demand that you make sense of them, and in most cases there is no sense to be made. And if you turn up your dog whistle detector, you will find it everywhere. I mean, it's just, and again, I've been on the other side of this.
Yeah.
And mention it on my podcast enough so that it's incredibly boring for listeners to hear me whinge about. But there is no answer to somebody saying, "Well, that's a dog whistle," when they can read a dog whistle into anything.
Yeah, I can see why you have a particular sensitivity to it, but I really want to stay away from always and never. And, yes, if you turn your dog whistle detector up to 11 and you try to see it everywhere, that's a bad approach. But I also think it's a bad approach to never see it. And I think you're verging in this case and in other cases on never seeing it. I think you're narrowing the possible field to literally utterances where someone says, I am a racist, or,
Well, no, I mean, it's not.
Is it really that much? Is what she said or what a lot of these folks on Fox are saying literally that close? Again, is that's the most likely interpretation? It says a lot about the way that he thinks. So it's either something that is endemic to him specifically, or it is the result of this ideology sinking in so deep, and the desire to push away the notion that people like Tucker Carlson or Laura Ingraham could have anything to say that is useful and comes from a good place and is valid. That realization would be so would disturb them so much that it would completely destroy their worldview. So I don't know which one of the things it is. It's probably a little bit of both. I think that it's increasingly, that's what I'm thinking it is. It's some combination of elements and probably a lot of ones that I'm not even aware of, because that's the way things work most of the time.
That is just, it's much more around. I guess let's just decide what racism is here for the purposes of this conversation. For me, it is, someone's a racist of a sort that we should care about if their political aims in some way entail living in a society where people of different races don't have the same political freedoms.
How about living in a majority white society? Wouldn't that make you a kind of white nationalist if you want to live in a more white nation or a majority white nation?
Yeah, well, but that does entail the principle I just invoked, which is, how do you get to a majority white society? You're infringing on somebody's political rights to get there.
Or to stick with the example of Laura Ingraham and also Tucker Carlson, one way of maintaining a white majority is to invoke replacement theory to scare old white people into wanting to close the border and put babies in cages in order to protect their white majority.
See, the thing is that he says old white people. He's speaking with animus to the very people that he's saying are conspiratorial in their thinking. Like, it's so, to me, it's so rational to, if you have people who literally are openly hostile towards white people, which really means white people that they see as being below them, white people that they've dehumanized, based on the fact that they speak about them in the way that they do. Because it's not talking about their kids. Maybe their kids will be white, or maybe they'll be, the result, they'll marry someone from another race. But of course, they're all going to be of a very similar culture. And either way, their genes are fine. Their friends are going to be fine. It's those people, those bad people that they have to dismiss in order to perpetuate their ideas. So the fact that he is so quick to go all the way to replacement theory, in its purest form, I think shows that he is guilty of the same kind of conspiratorial thinking that he seems to believe everyone else is engaged in.
That would be one way of doing it.
Right, but so again, this gets us into the dangerous territory of the way most people on the left wrangle with that concern is to assert that any serious conviction that we need defensible borders or that we should be able to admit who we want into the country and keep others out, that is synonymous with racism.
No. What I'm saying is when someone tells you my border policy is based on my specific invocation of race, vis-a-vis me saying that this is about protecting white people from being replaced and or about calling immigrants dirty in the case of Tucker Carlson, or referring to them as criminals, or...
You don't actually cite those statements in your book. And again, I said, so assuming Tucker is sane and not racist for the moment, when he called them criminals, he might have been saying that it is a crime to sneak into the country and we can't not treat it as a crime. That could be what he meant by calling them criminals. Again, I don't know what you're referring to, but...
Well, I mean, I'm referring to a few instances, one of which happened after the book went to press, so I couldn't include it. But I mean, Tucker has done this many, many times. And, you know, I'd be happy to ask him in person what he meant, and I'm sure he'd be able to come up with an explanation. But I just think, look, at a certain point, when you have a pattern and practice of behavior, yeah, you could say, well, my concerns with the border are just purely economic. And, you know, instead of reading all the economists, I've only read George Borjas. And I've been convinced that, you know, this is a drain on our economy and, you know, it has nothing whatsoever to do with race. You could say that, except that then if you're Laura Ingraham in the quote we're discussing, you're tipping your hand by saying, no, this is about white conservatives being replaced. That is...
Wait. You're tipping your hand. The Democrats, I mean, it is just obvious that people, it's not a judgment call. It's just objectively speaking. There are certain people that are older and white who are more likely to have more conservative beliefs, and that if you bring people in from South America, they're more likely to have beliefs that are further left for a variety of reasons. That observation in and of itself, I don't know why that doesn't necessarily... I don't know why you would look at that in a malevolent context. To me, you can dispassionately look at that and be like, well, yeah, that's what it is. And one of the big tells, I'm going too long, so I'm actually going to need to wrap this up. There was more I wanted to cover in this. And then Sam does, you know, gets into his own sort of delusions as I see it. But the biggest tell is that, like I saw Ilhan Omar today, she said, you know, somebody was talking about the economics of the border and all of this sort of stuff, like that it drives, having people come in who are willing to work for less and all this, it does drive down wages. It just does. That is a concern for people. And even if a person had no racial animus whatsoever, and really just cared about that element of it. It is a salient argument in its own right, and for whatever reason, mostly because I don't think they want to look at it, there is an immediate assumption that that individuals who don't necessarily want open borders or something closer to that are doing so specifically because of some badly motivated racist type things. And again, I just think that that's just a convenient belief for them. I think that that is a belief that they have to maintain in order to still feel like they're moral and just and good people, and that they're on the side of the oppressed and whatnot. So this is going too long, so I'm gonna need to cut it short, but there is some more interesting stuff in here. Anyways, I will see you all later.